There are several ways to tell the history of Unitarianism and Universalism. In this first video, I'm going to give a fairly standard account of Unitarian and Universalist history, and then Unitarian Universalist history. In two subsequent videos, I'll look at Unitarian and Universalist history, first emphasizing the role of women and non-white people, and second, looking at Unitarian and Universalist history from the perspective of what Robert Coles has called doing documentary work. This last approach will, I think, yield some very interesting results for people doing history today. Before I begin this video, I have to apologize because I'm probably going to make appalling mispronunciations of many names. I have both a tin ear for language and the remains of a Boston accent, so don't trust my pronunciations. I'll try to include subtitles in the finished video for all the names I mention. So let me start by giving you a brief overview of the standard consensus account of Unitarian and Universalist history. And to do this, I'm going to draw on the book Unitarian Universalism, A Narrative History by David E. Bumbaugh. David Bumbaugh taught courses in ministry at Meadville-Lombard Theological School, one of the two Unitarian Universalist theological schools in the United States, and he wrote this book as a one-volume overview of the topic for graduate students. Professor Bumbaugh begins his book by stating, Unitarian Universalism is a peculiar religious tradition in that what binds it together is not so much a shared theology or even a shared response to the sacred as it is a shared history. He begins his account of that shared history in the early years of the Christian movement with the followers of Arius, the so-called Arians, which is spelled with an I, not a Y. These Arians have nothing to do with the Arians of Nazism. So these early Arians asserted that Jesus, while more than human, was less than divine. While they lost out at the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, Arianism as a movement continued in Europe into the early medieval period before finally dying out. Thus, the theological concept that Jesus is not God, a central theological concept in the 19th century Unitarian movement in North America, can be traced back to early Christianity, or, at least, so goes this common historical account of Unitarian Universalist history. Professor Bumbaugh then makes a similar historical argument about the origins of the theological concept that all souls shall eventually be saved by God, a central concept in the Universalist movement in the late 18th and 19th centuries in North America. Here again, the common historical account traces the theological concept of universal salvation, this time back to early Christian thinkers, this time Origen and Clement of Alexandria. So this consensus view outlined by Professor Bumbaugh of the early Christian origins of Unitarianism and Universalism is not a view I find to be entirely convincing. Instead, what I read in this consensus account is that Unitarian Universalism has its roots firmly in the Protestant Reformation, more particularly the Radical Reformation of 17th century England, including Puritanism. Over and over again, the movements within Protestantism, within the Protestant Reformation, have asserted that they are the ones who are going back to the true original teachings of the early Christian church. But I digress. Let me get back to the consensus account of Unitarian Universalist history. Next on the timeline of Unitarian Universalist history is the emergence of Unitarian theology in Poland in the mid-16th century. One of the primary theologians in this movement was a man named Fautus Socinus, so the early Unitarians in Poland are called Socinians. They were wiped out in the religio-political battles of the Counter-Reformation of the 17th century. Next on the timeline are the Transylvanian Unitarians. Modern Romania includes most of the historic Kingdom of Transylvania. King John Sigismund of Transylvania authorized a big debate between Unitarians and Trinitarians in the year 1568, and David Ferencz, better known by his westernized name of Francis David, won the debate. The king made Unitarianism one of the four legally acceptable religions in his kingdom, and there have been Unitarians in Transylvania ever since. There was essentially no contact between Anglophone Unitarians and Transylvanian Unitarians until about the mid-19th century, And the Transylvanian Unitarians have bishops and a significantly different theology, but we still like to claim them, perhaps so we can claim a greater antiquity for Unitarianism. Now we move west to the Anglophone world and forward in time to the 16th century. When England severed its ties with the Roman Catholic Church, the English kingdom joined the Reformation. Soon a diversity of theologies emerged on the British Islands, some of them quite radical. Many of the theologies in England's radical Reformation derived from theologies imported from continental Europe. Thus, we often like to point to people like Michael Servetus as one of the early Unitarian thinkers on the continent of Europe to whom we can trace our roots, though, as Professor Bumbaugh points out, Michael Servetus might not want to recognize us as his theological descendants. In any case, by the 18th century, there were a number of Universalist and Unitarian congregations scattered over the British Isles. Whether they evolved from within the radical Reformation or had continental roots is a matter of some debate. Since North America had been colonized by the British, you will not be surprised to learn that Universalism and Unitarianism cropped up in those colonies too. King's Chapel, the Anglican Church in Boston, revised its Book of Common Prayer in 1785 to remove all references to the Trinity. They got kicked out of the Anglican Communion as a result and became an independent congregation. Today they are affiliated with the Unitarian Universalist Association, and they still use their own version of the Book of Common Prayer. On the Universalist side, the consensus view has it that the first openly Universalist congregation was formed by John Murray in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and they built their own building in 1780. Murray had converted to Universalism in England under the influence of James Relly, emigrated to the colonies in 1770, and had been preaching in the colonies for 10 years subsequent to founding his congregation in Gloucester. Moving into the 19th century, Universalism began to grow explosively. Hosea Ballou, a Universalist preacher from central New England, published his book, A Treatise on Atonement, in 1805, thus setting forth the first definitive written statement of Universalism, although not all Universalists agreed with Ballou's arguments. John Murray, for example, certainly didn't agree with Ballou. At one point in the early 19th century, Universalism was supposedly the fifth largest denomination in the United States. Not bad for a theological position that was often reviled by more orthodox ministers. On the Unitarian side, a significant minority of New England churches became more theologically liberal through the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Their conservative opponents branded them with the worst epithet they could come up with, calling them Unitarians. The liberals gradually embraced this label, and in 1819 a minister named William Ellery Channing preached a sermon titled Unitarian Christianity, in which he set forth the principles of what was now called Unitarianism. Through the mid-19th century, Universalism, heading back to Universalism, changed considerably. Their theology gradually became maybe less liberal than that of Hosea Ballou. However, the Universalists ordained a woman, Olympia Brown, in 1863. Brown was the first American woman whose ordination was sanctioned by a denomination. By the end of the 19th century, Universalism was clearly in decline. In response, they tightened up their theological statement, vowing to remove the so-called Liberty Clause, which had allowed individuals the freedom to not affirm everything in the Winchester Profession, which was the name of the Universalist affirmation of faith. Returning to the Unitarians, they went through their own theological upheaval in the 19th century. First, the Transcendentalists, led by Ralph Waldo Emerson and Theodore Parker, headed up an intellectual revolution that affirmed individualism and other ideals of the European Romantic movement. The Transcendentalists battled with older Unitarians like William Ellery Channing for decades. Then Octavius Brooks Frothingham and other ministers affiliated with a loose group called the Free Religious Association began stating that they no longer believed that Jesus was their leader. In the early 20th century, Unitarianism and Universalism began slowly moving closer together. A fair number of ministers held dual fellowship with both the Unitarians and the Universalists, and one or two congregations even merged together. And both denominations were equally shaken by the humanist controversy. By 1920, Unitarian ministers Curtis W. Reese, John H. Dietrich, and Charles Francis Potter were saying that they did not believe in God. Potter also held fellowship with the Universalists, and Universalist minister Clinton Lee Scott was another humanist. The battle between humanists and theists still continues today within Unitarian Universalism. The Great Depression in the 1930s killed off a great many congregations in the United States, and the Universalists were particularly hard hit, although the Unitarians also saw a substantial decline. The Unitarians and Universalists had begun formal cooperation by 1937 with the publication of a joint hymnal called Hymns of the Spirit. The denominational youth movements merged in the 1950s, and in many cities and towns, local Unitarian and Universalist congregations began merging. By 1961, the Unitarians and the Universalists formally and legally merged. Legally, the term is consolidated. Dana Greeley, the first president of the newly formed Unitarian Universalist Association, called on Unitarian Universalists to support the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And there's a famous photograph of Greeley at the head of a phalanx of clergy in the famous march from Selma to Montgomery. However, in 1968, the denomination was split over the so-called Black Empowerment controversy, and the result was the exodus from the denomination of a good number of Black Unitarian Universalists. Then, from the 1970s through the 1980s, Unitarian Universalists confronted sexism. In particular, the principles and purposes of the Unitarian Universalist Association, then a little-noticed portion of the association's bylaws, were filled with gendered language and male imagery. In 1985, the denomination adopted a new section of principles and purposes for their bylaws, informed by feminism. So when you hear talk of the 7 principles, that's part of this section of the rewritten bylaws. Then a new hymnal with gender-neutral language appeared in 1993, and that's the gray hymnal that we still use today. Obviously, in so brief an introduction, I've left out a great many details, but this gives us enough to examine critically the consensus view of Unitarian Universalist history, which I'll start doing in the next video.